G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. This is the show that rejects the phony binaries of left and right, or even right and wrong, and instead tries to get its hands dirty by wrestling with some of the biggest subjects in culture and society and politics, caring only about whether or not people make sense. Today's conversation is a fascinating one. The word woke is so tired these days. There are so many people on all kinds of platforms banging on about how bad woke is and woke this and woke that. It's lost all of its meaning, except for in the mind of today's guest, who makes the point that there remains a cultural elite which uses the language of social justice to gain power and status without really doing anything that benefits the lives of historically disadvantaged or marginalised people. This episode is part of Permission to Think, which is a collaboration that we do with the University of Technology, Sydney, thanks to Professor Alan Davison. And Musa al-Gharbi, today's guest, is an assistant professor of sociology who studies how knowledge workers have improved their cultural power by deploying the language of social justice to essentially justify our position and our status, and also to portray the losers of the knowledge economy as somehow deserving their fate because they haven't been, sufficiently woke to how to say the right things about race and gender and sexuality. Musa is by no means a right-wing, anti-woke firebrand. He is a black Muslim American academic who wrestles deeply with these ideas. His latest book is called We Have Never Been Woke: The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. Here, he and I wrestle with the Great Awokening, what it was really about, how ideas are the currency in the knowledge economy that most of us live in, and how we can actually help the marginalised and the disadvantaged. As always, you should do yourself a favour and get all of my shows in full, ad-free, at Substack, following the link in the show notes. You can also watch this interview on YouTube. I hope you find as fascinating, as scintillating as I did, the one and only Musa al-Gharbi. I'm sure that you are totally sick and tired of people asking you to define what wokeness is, because like you, it's a term that I don't tend to use. I think it's just become a cudgel that people on the right can use to level at anything that they don't like. You'll hear people say that anyone who's trans is woke, or that anyone who's a feminist is woke. And I know you're reticent to put a crisp definition on it, but can we just talk about a constellation of things that we might think of as what you're talking about so that people don't end up at cross purposes?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things I stress in the book is that there's this kind of move in the discourse where people try to force someone to define something in some kind of crisp, analytic, unobjectionable way. And if it turns out people can't do that, then they go, aha, you don't even know what you're talking about. And so on the right now, there's a tendency to do this with like interrogating democratic lawmakers or progressive people to define what a woman is. And if they can't come up with then they go, aha, see, you're a fool. And then on the flip side, they do the same thing with terms like woke. If you can't define woke in a crisp, analytic, unobjectionable way, then you're not talking about anything. It's a weird, empty moral panic, and so on and so forth. But the thing about it is that's not even the way. That's just not the way that language works. This is the big problem with this move. So in my interpersonal communications class, I have my students define apple. I say, define an apple for me using the necessary and sufficient conditions that include 100% of apples and don't include anything else. And it turns out we'll spend 20 minutes in class. I'll spend 20 minutes with a room of 30 people trying to have them define apple. And it turns out it's really hard. Now, that doesn't mean after spending 20 minutes and showing that no one in the class can define apple, even together they can't define apple. That doesn't mean if I tell one of them to grab me an apple, they're going to hand me a fish or a sponge or something like that, right? Like, that's just not the way.
Wait, just at the risk of chasing a red herring here, why can't they just look up the Latin term for the apple tree plant and say an apple is the ripe fruit of genus, what should we call it?
Well, so you can do that, but that's kind of tautological, right? That's like saying
I see.
An apple is an apple.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
But yeah. I mean, that's the closest that we can that we can get to that. It's doing exactly that.
Okay, so wokeness is one of the things that you point to is that a person would not be accused of being woke if they were not a feminist. So being a feminist is a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient, because if they were a feminist who excluded transgender women from the class of women, they also wouldn't be considered woke. So you might think of the position that the feminist position that includes all trans women might be a position that would normally be associated with what we would call woke. That would be an easy one, right?
Absolutely. So yeah, what I do in the book, instead of providing a definition, is I walk people through the history of the term, and then I use a couple of examples of beliefs and dispositions that people across the spectrum, whether you're on the left, you're on the right, no matter where you are, you would recognize someone who holds that belief. You would say someone who holds that belief, it wouldn't be unreasonable to call them woke. And if someone didn't hold that belief, it would definitely be wild.
Okay.
So trans-inclusive feminism is a great example. Someone who's not a feminist is definitely not woke. Someone who's not a trans-inclusive feminist is definitely not woke. And that's something that even people across the spectrum could agree on. So I walk through a few of these kinds of things, like, for instance, the idea that all of us harbor deep-seated prejudice and discrimination along the lines of race or ethnicity. We can never truly purge ourselves of this, but we have to try to kind of do the work to understand our bias and to be aware of our biases and things like this. We can't fully understand what it's like to be to belong to some group that's other than our own, but we should try to understand. But if we ever say we do understand, then that's a sign of arrogance or something like this.
In fact, I would even hazard to say that maybe the claim that you should try to understand is an unwoke claim, in the sense that the most woke people will regard it as being condescending or arrogant for a white person to say that they, understand what a person of color is going through as a person of color, or a straight person.
So you can't claim that you understand, but you do have to do research to try to understand. So if you don't bother to exert effort about the struggles that African Americans undergo or something like that, that's a problem. But if you do claim to say, "Oh, I know what it's like to be black," then that's a problem.
And you call this
somewhere in between.
You say this is a sort of a mysticism towards identity, right? That identity is this mystical thing, that you have that there are these kind of paradoxes in the woke worldview where you have intrinsic characteristics as a consequence of the identity groups to which you belong, at the same time as those characteristics are culturally created. So race doesn't exist, but at the same time, it's immutable, and you can't possibly understand the lived experience of someone from another race. And it's futile to try to overcome racism because it's that intrinsic, even though it's culturally constructed.
But you have to try to overcome racism, even though it's actually impossible. And and race, as you said, it's a fiction. But if a non-white person tries to pass as white, that's viewed as problematic. If a white person tries to pass as something other than white, that's also problematic. So it's a fiction, but it's not something that you're permitted to change. But even I should emphasize that. So these beliefs like that are mystical, but by describing them as mystical, I describe them as mystical in the book, but I don't mean that as a criticism. So I subscribe. I'm a Muslim. I subscribe to a number of beliefs that I would consider mystical in the same way, like predestination and free will. They don't fit easily together. And so I don't think that's I don't think that's bad or a problem, but I think that these kinds of tensions do need to be wrestled with, actually, and kind of acknowledged. And so there is a sense in which a lot of beliefs that are associated with wokeness do have this kind of mystical dimension to them, where there's this kind of deep kind of paradoxical tensions.
And I should point out to the listener that you weren't even born and raised a Muslim, so you chose your mysticism, you chose your mystical Muslim beliefs. Another thing that you say that is a characteristic of wokeness is what you call asymmetrical multiculturalism. What's that?
Yeah. So this is a term that I borrowed from a political scientist, Eric Kaufman. And so asymmetrical multiculturalism is when you interpret the actions and beliefs of certain groups one way and other groups another way. So for instance, It's good and appropriate to celebrate for people who are not white, to celebrate their race and ethnicity and their heritage and things like that. So you can talk about the positive attributes of Black people, how Black people are so great, how Asian Americans contributed so much to American society, how Asian American culture is so fascinating and whatever, but you can't do this for white people. You can't talk about how whites are so great, how white people contributed so much, and so on. And in a likewise manner, certain behaviors. So, for instance, when non-white people choose to, if African Americans, for instance, choose to hire and promote other African Americans, or prefer to work with people who are other African Americans, or who choose to live in communities that have lots of other African Americans, these are often described in positive terms. They're analyzed through the lenses of like leveraging of social solidarity and leveraging social capital to help other people from your same group, achieve social mobility and so on. When white people engage in the exact same behaviors, if they prefer to hire and promote other whites and live in communities with other whites and so on, they're analyzed through a completely different set of repertoires, through the lens of prejudice and discrimination, and these same behaviors that are celebrated with African Americans and other ethnic minorities are condemned when white people do it. And so this tendency to think about and analyze the behaviors of white people and non-white people in completely different ways, or to praise and celebrate people's ethnic heritage so long as it's not white heritage. These are examples of what Kaufman described as asymmetrical multiculturalism.
So just to push back on whether or not that's inconsistent, which brings us to maybe a bigger worldview of what wokeness might mean in a useful definition, if I could be audacious enough to take a stab at it and see what you think. It strikes me that would not be inconsistent if your worldview was that the salient force in culture and society and the economy is not economic inequality, but a battle between groups that are vying for power, and that members of certain identity groups, namely straight people, white people, and males, have for a long time lorded themselves over everybody else and deprived everybody else of their fair share of the pie. Hard to deny that as a basic claim. And the correct remedy to that is to think about culture and society as being and the economy as being a set of warring identity groups. And the solution to what ails us is to elevate traditionally marginalized groups and to impose new norms through kind of censorious speech codes on how we ought to think about the relations between those groups, the things that members of each group can say to the other. So then you get into the territory of, a white person telling a black person that they like their hair, and that becomes a microaggression because black people have spent far too long having condescending white people remark on how unique their hair is, when actually their hair is no more unique than white people's hair. It's just that white people aren't used to it. And so in this worldview of...
Although interestingly, again, it is a problem if you compliment black people's hair, but it's also a problem if you say anything disparaging.
Just don't talk about black people's hair, Musa. This is the rule, the cardinal rule. But so my sort of attempt to make a broader definition of what we're talking about would be that it's this shift from thinking about things in kind of an almost Marxist era economic paradigm to an identity-based paradigm where you're looking at the world through the prism of membership of identity groups and trying to change the norms around the way that those identity groups relate to one another, such that we become hyper-focused on things that could instantiate the power differential and the privilege that exists between different members of those groups. Is that close?
Yeah, I mean, so I think this focus on identity and identitarianism is deeply bound up with wokeness, and this has been the case for roughly a century now. So a lot of people think that a lot of these ideas are new. Maybe they started in the 60s, according to some. But for instance, so Kaufman's research shows, for instance, this tendency towards asymmetrical multiculturalism. It goes back to the 1920s. People have been doing this for symbolic capitalists, knowledge economy professionals. They've been doing this for like a century now. They've had this worldview. And as I show in the book, the previous, well, actually, even in Orwell, so George Orwell wrote a book called The Road to Wigan Pier. at the tail end of the first Great Awokening in the 1920s and early 30s. And in that book, he shows that one of the things the book explores is that the left at that time and today talks about how they are committed to helping the marginalized and the disadvantaged and the working class and so on, but they don't really have any kind of meaningful connection to genuinely marginalized and disadvantaged people or working class people. They don't know what those people want or think about anything. And when they're confronted with the views of those people, they often recoil in horror and try to micromanage them. And more than that, he argued, even socialist, even ostensibly class-based organizations, he said, often end up devolving into these kind of niche identitarian things. So he has this great quote in The Road to Wigan Pier, which was, again, written a century ago almost, where he says, "It seems like the words socialism and communism, almost as if with magnetic force, draw to them every feminist, every sex deviant, every vegetarian and nature cure quack, all of them in sandal wearing person, all of them in England."
He sounds like Tucker Carlson.
And so one of the things that he criticizes in Wigan Pier is that a lot of people who claim to be socialists or communists or so on, they don't actually spend much of their efforts on class-based organizing or working class anything. They spend almost all of their focus on kind of niche identitarian and other kind of stuff that's popular among highly educated, relatively affluent people, but that alienates everyone else. So this has been true for a century now.
Okay. Musa, you mentioned in passing symbolic capitalists, which is a fundamental part of your worldview, and it wasn't a term that I was familiar with. What is symbolic capitalism? What are symbolic capitalists?
Yeah, so symbolic capital is a term that I cribbed from a different sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu. And what symbolic capital is, in his account, is they're the kind of cultural resources that elites draw upon to make inequalities seem normal or appropriate. So he came up with so for instance, if you say, hey, the reason you should listen to me is because I have a PhD in blah, or I'm a professor at X university, or I write for the New York Times. These are examples of leveraging a type of symbolic capital that he calls academic capital. Or if you say, you should listen to what I say because I'm the manager, and if you don't, I'll rate you up. Or if you say, you should listen to, or if people are trying to defer to you and to follow your plan and to do the things that you want them to do because they think you're interested and cool and sophisticated and they want to impress you and ingratiate themselves with you. These are examples as well of different types of symbolic capital. So symbolic capital are the kind of cultural resources that elites draw on to get other people to do the things that they want them to do without coercing them.
Got it. So we're basically talking about knowledge economy workers in the modern context, right? I mean, symbolic capitalism
and so I call
would
these knowledge economy workers, I call them symbolic capitalists because the way we make a living basically is by what we know, who we know, and how we're known. So by producing and leveraging symbolic capital.
Okay, so universities, journalists, media people, business titans, people who work with ideas instead of producing physical things. I mean, I've heard you make a fascinating analogy in the medical profession between the distinction between physicians on the one side and surgeons and dentists and people who actually work with their hands on the other. Can you tease that out?
Yeah, absolutely. So the fundamental divide is between people who provide physical goods and services to people and people who don't. So physicians, when you look at what a physician does,
and this is what we would call a GP or a general practitioner outside of the United States, your family doctor.
Absolutely. Well, the main thing they do is they diagnose and they prescribe. So that's the main thing they do. They don't perform physical interventions on your body. They don't even do things like collecting samples. Typically, they have people for that. They'll send in someone else to collect your samples. They'll send in someone else to run your tests. They just diagnose and prescribe. They don't do anything to you. And this is in contrast with people like surgeons who are defined by the activity of cutting you open and messing with your internal organs, or dentists, and so on. And it turns out that this divide within the medical profession between people who diagnose and prescribe, and the people who perform physical interventions on people's bodies. So in the contemporary era, physicians are overwhelmingly aligned with the Democratic Party. Surgeons are overwhelmingly aligned with the Republican Party. And that's interesting because they have similar levels of education, similar levels of income. They work in the same kinds of places. They live in the same kinds of communities, but they have completely different political and ideological leanings typically. And it turns out this goes way, 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 way back. From the beginning of the medical profession, people who diagnose and prescribe have looked down on people who actually do physical interventions on people's bodies. They kind of they've condescended to them and so on and so forth. And the people who do physical interventions on people's bodies have long resented and hated and struggled against the people who just diagnose and prescribe and don't actually do anything. There's been this long-standing enmity between these blocks within the medical profession that goes back as far as the professions go. I mean, like literally centuries. But what's interesting is in the contemporary era, this tension that's long been simmering in the medical professions has become one of the core tensions defining politics writ large in the United States. So the kind of people who do work where they're providing physical goods and services to people have been consistently over the last 50 years or so trending towards the Republican Party, whereas the people who work in the symbolic profession, so people who are lawyers, administrators, and people in consulting, finance, so on and so forth, they've all been aligning ever more robustly with the Democratic Party. And so this tension that's longstanding within the medical profession has now become this kind of broad schism in society, and not just in the United States, but actually, if you look at in the UK, for instance, as well, there you see a similar alignment. Thomas Piketty, an economist, Thomas Piketty, looked at France and the United States and the United Kingdom and found that in all three of these contexts, you see this reorientation where working class people and people who provide physical goods and services and so on have been aligning with right-aligned parties, and people who work in the symbolic professions across all three of these contexts have been increasingly aligned with the left-aligned parties.
That is a huge description, but isn't there an alternative hypothesis, which is the more reductionist economic one, which would say that doctors don't earn as much as surgeons and orthodontists and prosthodontists? And if you looked, for example, at dental hygienists who also work with their hands but are more lowly paid, they might be more likely to be left-wing. And if you looked at, financiers, the very top financiers, I'm sure, are right-wing, but the lower ones are left-wing, and the titans of media might be right-wing, but the lowly paid journalists who are doing the grunt work might be left-wing. Couldn't you still cleave it along more Marxist lines?
Well, what's interesting is that's not what you actually see for the most part, actually. So like even the kind of super elites, so increasingly the millionaires and the billionaires who are aligned with the symbolic professions, not only are they typically aligned with the left in the Democratic Party, but they actually tend to be even further to the left than activists within the Democratic Party. They're one of the main people that are pulling the Democratic Party left, especially on cultural issues.
But who are we talking about in the US context, if not Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and Jeff Bezos?
But Elon Musk is actually
on the right.
But Elon Musk is a prime example of an elite who would be on the right. Most of his companies are involved with producing physical goods and services. Tesla is an auto manufacturer. He has the Boring Company, has SpaceX, which is a transport, fundamentally a shipping and logistics company.
Yeah, but he works in the world of ideas and hires other people to do the physical work.
Well, but but the industries that he's created and affiliated with are involved with physical extraction and producing physical goods and services. So he's actually exactly the kind of an elite who would be aligned with the Republican Party.
Okay.
Even though his own, like literally what he's doing day to day isn't manufacturing cars, but the kind of industries that he's a part of are distinctly aligned with the Republican Party.
I see. Okay. So let's take that on face value. And so your claim is what? That we in the knowledge economy, symbolic capitalists, sort of leverage social justice discourse to blame the losers from the knowledge economy for the problems that we benefit from. Is that
Yeah, I mean,
way
that's
of
one of
phrasing
the
it?
things that, yeah, absolutely. So I'll give an example. Um, so within a lot of knowledge economy spaces, there's this narrative that people have to acknowledge their privilege and that people who possess white privilege are unworthy of what they have. They're okay. So there's a couple problems with the white privilege narrative. One of them being that it's just not the case that all white people share the same benefit the same from their race. And so in the book, I tease this out by looking at height. So the, there's a lot of unearned benefits you get from being tall, um, but how much mileage you get out of being tall depends a lot on the circumstances that you find yourself in. If you're in a community where lots of other people are tall, then you don't see those same advantages on the dating market, on the job market, and so on. You're just average relative to your
It
circumstances.
sucks
The
to
way
be
you
a
get
tall Dane.
absolutely. The way you get a lot of benefit out of your height would be to be in a circumstances or a community where you're surrounded by lots of other people who are shorter than you. And so the same kind of thing is true for most other unearned advantages. And so the way that we like to talk about white privilege in this universalistic way is very convenient for knowledge economy professionals. It allows a white professional who lives in Manhattan, for instance, to pretend as if they benefit from their race in the same way as someone who lives in a small town in North Dakota and works at a 7-Eleven. They do not benefit from their race in the same way. The professional who lives in a city like Manhattan with lots of desperate and poor minorities to lord their white privilege over benefits much more from their race. But setting that aside, the reality is, when you look at poverty in America, the lion's share of poor people, a plurality of poor people in the United States, are white. And so if you subscribe to a worldview that lets you look at those people and say, "Hey, guess what? All of these poor and suffering people, we don't owe them anything. We don't have to reallocate anything to them. In fact, they deserve their suffering. They deserve their poverty." That's a very convenient view for elites to hold. And I'll say, there's even empirical literature that shows when you train people about white privilege, it doesn't change anything at all about how people who undergo the training, it doesn't change anything at all about how they think about non-white people or how they engage in non-white people. The main thing it changes is it causes them to look at poor whites and to think, those people must really deserve their poverty. They were born with all this privilege and they're poor. Well, then they must really. And so
this is J.D. Vance's sort of ethos, which is weird because we're describing this as a woke perspective, but it's, read Hillbilly Elegy, and it's basically saying these white people deserve to be where they are.
Well, this is why J.D. Vance was actually a New York Times bestseller and why he was picked up and beloved so much, I think.
We were all reading him in 2017. It was like, all the white elites were trying to figure out what the hell happened with the election of Donald Trump. And, J.D. was our beacon of sanity.
Yeah, well, because he was affirming a lot of the beliefs that white people, that people like us already have about those people. That actually the reason they're poor is because they're slovenly. They sit around waiting for handouts. They're entitled, and unlike J.D. Vance, who pulled himself up by his bootstraps and went to the military and so on and so forth. So, yeah, Hillbilly Elegy is a great book for people like us. We read Hillbilly Elegy, and it allows us to think, oh, wow, yeah, those people deserve it. They have it coming. If they're poor, they deserve their poverty. And the same thing.
As long as they're white.
Huh?
As long as they're white. If they're black and poor, then we deprive them of the agency to be deserving of the poverty.
Yes, absolutely. And so this is this is a way in which this white privilege discourse on its face, it's about social justice, it's egalitarian and justice oriented and whatever. But in practice, the way it actually functions in the world, it often allows people who are elites to look at people who are the losers in the knowledge economy and to think that those people actually deserve their suffering. We don't have to allocate anything to them. In fact, they would just misuse it the way that they abuse their white privilege. And in fact, those people probably actually have more than they deserve already. They were born white with all this privilege. They probably already have more than they deserve based on their merits and so on and so forth.
But just to push back on this in two ways. Firstly, you say that the lion's share of poor people are white. Yes, but not proportionate to the population, right? I mean, people of color are disproportionately poor in America. So a pure numerical analysis seems deficient. And secondly, isn't it the case that the left is more concerned with trying to help white poor people than the right that is at the moment? I mean, if it were the case that wokeness is what is depriving the elites of the compassion to give benefits to white poor people, then why is it the left that is in favor of food stamps? Why is it the left that implements Obamacare? Why is it the left that tries to expand, programs that uplift the poor and not the right?
Well, the left, so they support things like Obamacare and food stamps and things like this, but often explicitly framing them and describing them as racial justice, as initiatives to help poor minorities and stuff. If these policies were framed as a way of helping poor whites, actually Democrats would hate them, and that's why they're not framed that way, and they're not discussed that way. And in fact, this is.
But they are discussed in race-neutral ways. I think I don't remember Obamacare. Maybe this predates the Great Awokening too much, but I don't remember Obamacare being framed as a way to help poor black people.
Well, they do. Yeah, actually, they even like the discussion about SNAP benefits and food stamps in the United States has always been, for instance, as an example, has always been heavily racialized in a way that is unfortunate, again, because actually a plurality of the people who use food stamps are white. But when people think about food stamps, they, on all sides of the aisle, they associate it with, say, black people or Hispanics. And
but isn't that because of the first objection that I made, which is that they're disproportionately overrepresented in that group, people of color?
Well, sure, but this is the point. It's like if they're disproportionately, I think it's important to keep both of these thoughts in the head at once, right? So if they're disproportionately if they're overrepresented, but they're not, but most people who receive food stamps are not that. In fact, if you were going to pick a random person out of a hat who receives food stamps, they would be more likely to be white than anything, no matter how many times you did the poll. So it's important to keep that in the head, while also recognizing that black people do have higher poverty rates than whites and are more likely to be on, say, to rely on these services than whites. So both of these things are true at the same time. And I think one of the problems in some of the discourse about this stuff is that we focus, we being progressives especially, like to focus a lot on things like proportionality. There's a political scientist, Adolph Reed Jr., who talks about this a lot, about the focus on disparities and who's disproportionate this, who's disproportionate that, to the point where we lose sight in many cases of the base rates. But in any case, the point I was making about white privilege is just that, again, in practice, what this white privilege discourse does, and we can see this in empirical studies even, it doesn't lead people to treat or think about.
To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen, and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing. If it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack.